There are stories from the Old West that never made it into history books, tales of ordinary people facing impossible choices in a land that promised everything but guaranteed nothing. This is one of those stories. Imagine a frozen Christmas Eve in 1878, somewhere in the harsh Wyoming wilderness, where snow fell like frozen tears and the wind howled through empty train stations like a ghost. A young woman named Catherine O'Malley sat alone in an abandoned freight car, her body shaking from cold, her stomach aching from hunger, her heart breaking from the truth she could no longer deny. She had been deceived, abandoned, and left to die on the most sacred night of the year. She had crossed an ocean and traveled thousands of miles to marry a man who had promised her a home, only to discover that everything had been a cruel lie. As the temperature dropped and darkness surrounded her, Catherine wrapped herself in her thin shawl and prepared for what she believed would be her last night alive. But then, through the howling storm and her fading consciousness, she heard footsteps crunching through the snow, felt strong arms lifting her from the frozen ground, and heard a voice, rough as sandpaper but steady as stone, saying the words that would change her life forever. "Get up," the cowboy said. "You're coming home." Catherine O'Malley grew up in a tiny village in Ireland where everyone knew hunger as well as they knew their own names. She was born in 1857 into a family that worked land they would never own, planting crops that barely kept them alive, and watching the landlords grow fat while they grew thin. Her father broke his back in the fields every day, and her mother's hands were cracked and bleeding from endless washing and cooking. Catherine was the third of 7 children, which meant she learned early that there was never enough food, never enough warmth, never enough hope to go around. By the time she was 10 years old, she was doing the work of an adult, caring for her younger brothers and sisters, hauling water from the well before sunrise, and watching her dreams disappear into the smoke of their cooking fire. When Catherine turned 20, she made a decision that shocked her family, but also made perfect sense to anyone who understood desperation. She heard about agencies that arranged marriages between Irish women and American men who lived on the frontier. These men needed wives, and these women needed escape. The agency would pay for the passage to America, and in return, the woman would marry the man who selected her. People in the village called these women mail order brides, and they whispered about them with a mixture of judgment and envy. Catherine did not care what people whispered. She knew that if she stayed in Ireland, she would marry a local farmer and spend her life repeating her mother's story of endless work and slow starvation. She wanted something different, even if it meant marrying a stranger in a land she had never seen. Catherine walked 7 miles through freezing rain to reach the agency office in the nearest town. The woman behind the desk was businesslike and cold, explaining that Catherine would need to provide a photograph and a letter describing herself. She would be placed in a catalog, and men in America would choose from the available women. Once chosen, Catherine would be expected to honor her commitment no matter what she found when she arrived. There would be no backing out, no returning home if things were not as promised. Catherine agreed to everything. She had her photograph taken wearing her only decent dress, and she wrote a letter saying she was healthy, hardworking, and ready for frontier life. She did not mention that she was terrified, that she had never been more than 10 miles from home, or that she was gambling her entire future on the hope that a stranger thousands of miles away was telling the truth. 3 months later, Catherine received news that changed everything. A man named Gerald Hutchins had selected her from the catalog. He described himself as a successful rancher in Wyoming territory with land, cattle, and a good house. His letter was polite and formal, promising her a better life than she could ever have in Ireland. The photograph showed a respectable-looking man in his 30s. Catherine read the letter over and over, trying to imagine what her life would be like, trying to convince herself that this was real and not just another cruel trick that fate played on desperate people. She said goodbye to her family on a gray morning in September of 1878, knowing she might never see them again. Her mother cried, her father shook her hand with rough affection, and her little brothers and sisters clung to her until she had to gently push them away. Then she walked to the port, boarded a ship packed with other immigrants, and sailed away from everything she had ever known. The ocean crossing was worse than anything Catherine had imagined. She traveled in steerage, crammed into the lowest decks with hundreds of other desperate souls seeking new lives in America. The smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and fear was so thick she could barely breathe. She was violently seasick for most of the 3-week voyage, unable to keep down even the terrible food they were given. She lay in her narrow bunk listening to people cry, pray, and sometimes die around her. There were moments when she wondered if she would survive the journey, moments when she questioned whether she had made the worst mistake of her life. But whenever doubt threatened to crush her, she thought about the alternative, the slow death by poverty that awaited her in Ireland, and she found the strength to keep going. When the ship finally reached New York Harbor, Catherine stood on deck with tears streaming down her face as she saw the massive city spreading before her. She had never seen so many buildings, so many people, so much noise and chaos. Ellis Island was a nightmare of inspections and questions. Officials examined her like livestock, checking her eyes, her teeth, asking questions in English she barely understood. She was terrified they would send her back across the ocean, but eventually they stamped her papers and allowed her to enter America. She clutched her small bag and the envelope containing her train tickets to Wyoming Territory, and she stepped onto American soil feeling both excited and completely alone. The train journey westward took days and showed Catherine an America she could never have imagined. She watched through the window as cities gave way to farms, then to endless prairies that seemed to go on forever, then to mountains that touched the sky. She shared her railcar with other travelers, including several women who were also mail-order brides heading west. They formed a temporary bond, sharing food and stories, offering each other courage. One woman warned Catherine that frontier life was brutal, and that many brides discovered their husbands were not the successful men their letters had claimed. But she also spoke of the freedom and opportunity that the West offered to people willing to work hard and take risks. Catherine listened to everything, trying to prepare herself for whatever awaited her, trying to imagine the moment when she would meet Gerald Hutchins and begin her new life. As the train carried her deeper into Wyoming Territory in late December, Catherine felt the temperature dropping and saw snow beginning to fall. She rehearsed what she would say when she met her husband, how she would present herself, how she would begin building a life with this stranger. She allowed herself to hope, despite the warnings, despite the fear growing in her chest. When the train finally pulled into Cheyenne on Christmas Eve, Catherine gathered her belongings and stepped onto the platform, searching desperately for the man from the photograph. But as the platform cleared and other passengers were met by family and friends, Catherine stood alone in the freezing wind, slowly understanding that something was terribly wrong. Catherine waited on that platform for hours, her hopes slowly turning to confusion and then to fear. She asked the station master if there had been any messages left for her, but there was nothing. The station master, a gruff man with little patience, told her that if she needed somewhere to stay, she would have to find lodging in town because the station was closing for the night. But Catherine had no money for lodging and no idea where to go. She had spent everything she had just to get to this moment, and now she was stranded in a strange town on Christmas Eve with winter closing in around her. As afternoon turned to evening and the temperature plummeted, Catherine had to face the terrible truth. Gerald Hutchins was not coming. She did not know why, did not know if something had happened to him, or if he had simply changed his mind, but the reason did not matter anymore. She was alone in a foreign land with no resources, no friends, and no way to survive. She tried to stay warm in the station waiting room, but when it closed, she had nowhere to go. She walked through the town, past saloons where she could hear Christmas songs being sung by drunk men, past houses where families gathered around warm fires. She asked for help, but everyone turned her away. A woman traveling alone was suspicious. especially a foreigner with a thick accent who claimed to be a Maylord or bride. When full darkness fell and the cold became unbearable, Catherine found herself back at the train station, desperate for any shelter. She discovered an old freight car sitting on a side track with its door unlocked. She climbed inside, finding a corner among the crates and sacks, and wrapped herself in her thin shawl. She had not eaten since morning, and her stomach cramped with hunger. She could hear the town celebrating Christmas, could hear church bells ringing in the distance, and she thought about how far she had come only to end up dying alone in a freezing railcar. She thought about her family back in Ireland, wondered if they were thinking of her, wondered if they would ever know what happened to her. Catherine did not expect to survive the night. The cold was so intense that she lost feeling in her hands and feet. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind creating strange dreams where she saw her mother's face and heard her father's voice. She made peace with dying, accepting that her gamble for a better life had failed. But then, through the fog of cold and exhaustion, she heard something that seemed impossible. Footsteps in the snow, the freight car door opening, a voice, rough and deep, saying words that made no sense in her fading consciousness. And then strong hands were lifting her, wrapping her in warmth, carrying her away from death. Through her confusion, she heard that voice again, speaking with absolute certainty and unexpected kindness. "Get up," the cowboy said. "You're coming home." The man who saved Catherine's life was named Jack Sullivan, and he was not someone who usually got involved in other people's problems. He was a 32-year-old cowboy who worked on a ranch outside Cheyenne, a man weathered by years of hard living under the western sun. He had come to town on Christmas Eve to pick up supplies and have a few drinks before riding back to the ranch. He was walking past the train station when he heard a sound from inside the freight car, a small noise that most people would have ignored. But Jack had a stubborn streak that made him investigate things that seemed wrong, and when he opened that door and saw Catherine huddled in the corner, barely alive, something inside him shifted. Jack did not know who this woman was or how she had ended up dying in a freight car, but he knew he could not leave her there. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how close to death. He wrapped her in his own heavy coat, mounted his horse with her cradled against his chest, and rode out into the storm toward the ranch where he worked. It was a brutal ride through the freezing night, with snow falling thick and wind cutting through everything. But Jack had grown up in this country and knew how to navigate by instinct. He pushed his horse forward, knowing that the woman in his arms would die if he did not get her to warmth soon. When Jack reached the ranch after midnight, he carried Catherine to the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. He laid her on his own bed, built up the fire in the stove, and began the slow process of warming her carefully, knowing that warming someone too fast after severe cold could be dangerous. He removed her wet shoes, rubbed her frozen hands and feet, and wrapped her in every blanket he could find. He made her drink warm water mixed with whiskey, supporting her head and coaxing her to swallow even though she was barely conscious. Jack stayed awake all night watching over the stranger, keeping the fire going, making sure she survived. Catherine drifted in and out of awareness for hours, caught between nightmares and reality. But through all the confusion, she was aware of someone watching over her, keeping her alive, speaking to her in a low, steady voice. When she finally opened her eyes fully on Christmas morning, she saw a man sitting in a chair beside the bed, his head tilted back in exhausted sleep. He had dark hair that needed cutting, several days of stubble on his jaw, and the kind of weathered face that comes from living most of your life outdoors. Catherine did not know who he was, but she understood with sudden clarity that this stranger had saved her life. When Jack woke and saw Catherine watching him, he asked in his rough voice if she knew where she was. Catherine shook her head and began to explain her story, how she had come from Ireland to marry Gerald Hutchins, how he had never met her at the station, how she had nearly frozen to death waiting for a man who never came. As Catherine spoke, Jack's face grew dark with anger, and when she finished, He told her something that made her understand how completely she had been deceived. Gerald Hutchins was not a prosperous rancher. He was a con man who had placed advertisements with multiple mail-order bride agencies, collecting money from desperate women and their families, promising marriage, and then disappearing with his stolen gains. Jack explained that Hutchins had done this to at least a dozen women that he knew of, maybe more, and that he had left Cheyenne weeks ago, probably headed west to start the same scheme in another territory. Catherine listened to this with a strange numbness. She had traveled so far, risked everything, suffered so much, all for a lie. She had no money, no way home, and no idea what to do next. Jack seemed to understand her despair, and he offered her a lifeline. He told her she could stay at the ranch until she figured out her next move. The ranch owner, Thomas Whitmore, employed women in the ranch house as cooks and housekeepers, and they always needed help. If Catherine was willing to work, she would have a place to stay and food to eat until she could make other arrangements. Catherine accepted this offer with gratitude that went beyond words. She had been saved twice now, once from freezing and once from complete hopelessness. Over the following days, as Catherine recovered her strength, she began to understand the world she had entered. The Whitmore Ranch was a large cattle operation that employed about 20 cowboys and several women who ran the household. The work was hard and never-ending, but everyone earned their keep. Thomas Whitmore's wife, Margaret, was a strong woman who had come west as a young bride herself and had learned to thrive in harsh conditions. Margaret took Catherine under her wing, teaching her the skills she needed and giving her work in the kitchen. Catherine threw herself into this work with fierce determination, waking before dawn to help prepare breakfast, spending her days cooking and cleaning, falling into bed exhausted each night. It was hard labor, but it was purposeful, and it helped her rebuild the sense of self-worth that had been shattered on Christmas Eve. As winter deepened and Catherine settled into ranch life, she became increasingly aware of Jack Sullivan. He had saved her life and then quietly stepped back, not demanding gratitude or recognition, just watching over her in his unobtrusive way. Catherine learned his story through observation and through things other people told her. He had been born in Texas, lost his family young, and spent his life drifting from ranch to ranch, building a reputation as one of the best cowboys in the territory. He was known for being tough, reliable, and solitary, a man who kept to himself and did not form close attachments. But Catherine saw something beneath that rough exterior, a deep kindness and a sense of fairness that he tried to hide behind his weathered face and few words. Jack, for his part, found himself drawn to Catherine in ways that confused him. He had saved her because it was the right thing to do, not expecting anything in return. But as he watched her work and rebuild her life with courage and determination, he began to see her as someone special. She was not weak or defeated despite everything she had been through. She was strong in a quiet way that impressed him more than he wanted to admit. He found excuses to be near her, coming to the kitchen for coffee in the early mornings before heading out to work, sitting at the table while she prepared breakfast, and they would talk about small things in their halting way. Their conversations were brief at first, both of them awkward and uncertain, but gradually they became more comfortable. Catherine learned to read Jack's silences, to understand what he meant by the things he did not say. Jack learned to appreciate Catherine's dry humor and quiet strength. The other ranch hands noticed what was developing between them, and there was good-natured teasing but also approval. Margaret Whitmore noticed too, and she told Catherine bluntly that Jack Sullivan was a good man, probably the best man on the ranch, and that Catherine would be foolish to let him slip away. As the weeks passed, Catherine found herself feeling things she had not expected. She had come to America prepared to marry a stranger out of necessity, but what she felt for Jack was entirely different. It was not desperate gratitude or romantic fantasy. It was something real and solid, a recognition that this quiet cowboy saw her as a person of worth, someone who had survived something terrible and was rebuilding with courage. When Jack was away from the ranch for days at a time, Catherine found herself watching for his return, and when he came back, her heart would lift in a way that both frightened and thrilled her. In late January, a massive blizzard struck the territory with devastating force. It came suddenly, sweeping down with winds that reached terrifying speeds and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The ranch mobilized everyone to save the cattle scattered across the range, and Jack and the other cowboys rode out into the storm, risking their lives to round up as many animals as possible. Catherine and the other women worked around the clock keeping fires burning, preparing hot food, and tending to the men who came back half frozen from their rescue efforts. During the worst of the storm, Jack failed to return with the other men. Hours passed with no sign of him, and Catherine felt a fear that nearly paralyzed her. She realized, in those terrible hours of waiting, that she had come to care for Jack far more than she had admitted to herself, that the thought of losing him was unbearable. She begged Thomas Whitmore to send out a search party, but he explained gently that they could not risk more men in these conditions, that Jack knew the land better than anyone and would find his way back if anyone could. When Jack finally appeared near dawn, leading his exhausted horse and carrying a newborn calf he had rescued, Catherine nearly collapsed with relief. He was so cold he could barely speak, his hands frostbitten, but he was alive. Catherine helped him inside, got him out of his frozen clothes, and worked to warm him up, her hands shaking with emotion. Jack looked at her through his exhaustion and said quietly that he had thought of her out there in the storm, that thinking of her waiting had kept him going. It was the most he had ever revealed about his feelings, and Catherine understood that something fundamental had shifted between them. After the blizzard, Jack began to court Catherine in his understated way. He would bring her small gifts, a ribbon from town, a smooth stone from the creek, wildflowers when spring came. He asked her to walk with him in the evenings, and they would talk about their lives, their pasts, their hopes for the future. Jack told her things he had never told anyone, about his loneliness, about the losses he had suffered, about feeling like he had never truly belonged anywhere. Catherine shared her own story, the poverty that had driven her from Ireland, the pain of leaving her family, the terror of being abandoned. They found in each other a deep recognition and understanding. By April, everyone on the ranch knew that Jack and Catherine would marry. When Jack finally proposed, he did it in his straightforward way, telling Catherine that he wanted her to be his wife, that he did not have much to offer except hard work and an uncertain future, but that he would spend his life making sure she never regretted saying yes. Catherine looked at this honest, kind man who had saved her life, and then given her reasons to live it, and she said yes without hesitation. They were married in May of 1879 in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with everyone they knew in attendance. When Jack placed a plain gold ring on Catherine's finger, a ring he had saved months to buy, and kissed her in front of everyone, Catherine felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. Their first years of marriage were hard but filled with purpose. With help from Thomas Whitmore, Jack leased land where he could start his own homestead. He and Catherine worked side by side building a small cabin, breaking ground, starting a herd. Catherine discovered strengths she never knew she had, learning to shoot, ride, and survive in harsh conditions. In the spring of 1880, their son Daniel was born, and Catherine held her baby and wept with joy, thinking about how close she had come to dying alone in that freight car just over a year before. The years that followed brought both hardship and gradual success. Jack and Catherine's homestead grew slowly but steadily. They acquired more cattle, expanded their cabin, and had two more children, Mary and Thomas. The children grew up strong and capable, learning early to contribute to the work. There were droughts that tested them, harsh winters that challenged their endurance, illnesses that terrified them, and financial struggles that never seemed to end. But through everything, Jack and Catherine supported each other with a partnership forged in shared hardship. Catherine became involved in the growing community, helping establish a church and advocating for schools. She discovered she had talents for leadership and organization that had been dormant during her years of pure survival. As Wyoming Territory moved toward statehood in the 1890s, Catherine and Jack watched the wild frontier gradually transform into something more civilized. Their children grew and followed their own paths. Daniel took over the ranch, Mary became a teacher, and Thomas sought opportunities in the growing cities. Catherine watched them leave with pride, knowing she had given them the opportunities she never had. As Jack grew older, his body bearing the marks of decades of hard labor, he relied more on his son to run the ranch. Catherine worried about him but also helped him find new purpose in spending time with the grandchildren who began arriving. The early 20th century brought changes that would have seemed impossible to the young couple who had started with nothing. Automobiles and telephones and electricity transforming the West they had known. Jack remained suspicious of progress, but Catherine adapted, always looking forward while never forgetting where they had come from. In 1923, on a winter evening 45 years after that terrible Christmas Eve, Catherine sat by the fire in the home that she and Jack had built together. Jack had passed away the previous spring at the age of 77, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of hard use. Catherine missed him every day, but she also felt grateful for the decades they had shared, for the life they had built from nothing, for the family they had created. Their children and grandchildren visited often, filling the house with noise and life, and Catherine found joy in watching the next generations thrive. Catherine lived to the age of 72, passing away peacefully in her sleep in 1929, surrounded by family. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren spoke of her courage, her strength, and her determination to build something meaningful from the ashes of despair. They told the story of how she had nearly died on Christmas Eve 1878, abandoned and alone, and how a cowboy named Jack Sullivan had saved her life with 5 simple words. They spoke of how their love story had been forged not in romance but in mutual respect, shared hardship, and unwavering partnership. They remembered her not as a victim of circumstance but as a woman who had faced impossible odds and refused to be defeated. The homestead that Jack and Catherine built remained in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could create when they refused to give up. The story of that Christmas Eve, of the mail-order bride who slept hungry in a freight car and the cowboy who said, "Get up, you're coming home," became family legend, passed down through the years as a reminder of where they came from and what they had overcome. It was a story of the Old West at its most brutal and most beautiful, of desperate chances and unexpected redemption, of two lonely people who found each other in the darkness and built something that would outlast them both. Catherine O'Malley Sullivan's story is not unique in the broad sweep of Western history. Thousands of women came west as mail-order brides, gambling everything on the promise of a better life, and many of them faced disappointment, hardship, and tragedy. But Catherine's story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, even when all hope seems lost, the possibility of redemption exists. Her story is about more than survival. It is about the courage to keep going when everything seems impossible, about the kindness of strangers who become family, and about love that grows not from fairy tales but from shared struggle and mutual respect. That Christmas Eve in 1878, when Jack Sullivan found Catherine in that freezing freight car and said those 5 words that changed both their lives forever, he was not just saving one desperate woman. He was setting in motion a story that would echo through generations, creating a family that would help build the American West, raising children who would become teachers and ranchers and community leaders. The homestead they carved from harsh prairie land became a foundation for descendants who would spread across the country, each carrying within them the legacy of two people who refused to be defeated by circumstance. When we look back at the Old West, we often focus on the gunslingers and outlaws, the gold rushes and cattle drives, the dramatic moments that make for exciting stories. But the real West was built by people like Catherine and Jack, ordinary individuals facing extraordinary challenges, making impossible choices, and building lives from nothing through sheer determination and hard work. Their story reminds us that history is not just made by famous people doing famous things. It is made by countless small acts of courage and kindness, by people who choose to help rather than turn away, by those who refuse to give up even when giving up would be easier. Catherine's journey from a starving girl in Ireland to a dying woman in a freight car to a respected matriarch of a Western family is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It shows us that our lowest moments do not define us, that redemption can come from unexpected places, and that the family we build can matter more than the family we were born into. When Jack said, "Get up, you're coming home," he was offering more than physical shelter. He was offering belonging, purpose, and the possibility of a future that neither of them could have imagined. And Catherine, in accepting that offer and building a life with him, proved that sometimes the greatest courage is not in fighting but in accepting help, not in going it alone, but in trusting someone else to share the burden. Their story lives on not in history books or monuments, but in the descendants who still tell it, in the land that still bears the marks of their labor, and in the example they set of what two people can build when they face hardship with courage, meet challenges with determination, and treat each other with respect and love. That Christmas Eve may have been Catherine's lowest moment, but it was also the beginning of her greatest triumph. And that is why we remember it, why we tell this story, and why it still matters more than a century later.